Hello and welcome back to Supposedly Fun. My name is Greg, and I am here today to do a book haul revisit. If you're new here, this is where I look back at May's past and see how many books I brought into my library, and of those, I try to figure out how many I have read, how many I have unhauled, how many I would still like to read. It's my way of trying to make myself a more intentional book purchaser and reader. For instance, I have learned doing these book haul revisits that I am much more likely to listen to a nonfiction book on audio than I am to read it in physical form. It's just a weird quirk of me. I know there are people who kind of feel the opposite. They would rather read a nonfiction book, but it's the way it is for me. So we have 4 years of May's to look back to. We're going to start with 2022 and we're going to work our way back to 2019 and just take a look. A quick note on process. I am not going to spend a lot of time talking about what these books are about. As usual, I don't usually do that in a book haul revisit, but I will have links to all of the book haul videos down below. And if you would like more information about one of these books, I encourage you to go follow that link and check it out. I talk about the plots of the books. I usually look at the opening of them until you go a little further back, but you'll find a lot more information about them there. For this book haul, I have also decided that I am not going to include things that were sort of like free gifts for Independent Bookstore Day, which I had included in the book haul video and things like that. I am also not including Sue Grafton books because they were purchased for a very different reason. I wanted to reestablish my collection of Sue Grafton books after she died because I had decided to get rid of all of mine at some point and then I wanted them back. So they were purchased for a very different reason. I'm also not including Catch-22, which I believe is like right here on my shelf, because I purchased it not because I wanted to read it. I had already read it, and I used to love that book. And at some point, I realized I didn't own a copy of it, so I purchased it to have on my shelf. So it's a very different purpose from a lot of these other books. For the sake of time, let's get into it, because we have 4 years to look at. These are not very large book hauls. In fact, one of them is really small, but they are interesting. And 2022 is a really interesting case because I actually did 2 book haul videos last year. So there will be 2 down below. One of them is an unboxing. I did one of those curated book boxes from Good Neighbor Bookstore in New York. This is the t-shirt that I'm wearing. And it's a really great store in New York that fosters empathy through reading, which I think is a really great mission. So I had asked them to select some books for me. And I can't remember what the prompts I used, but I wanted a book that they thought more people should talk about, a book that they thought stood for the mission of the store, and so on and so forth. So the first 3 books came from that book box, and then we'll get into the book haul proper from May. And the first book that came from the Good Neighbor Bookstore curated book box was Life Went On Anyway, Stories by Oleg, Sentsov, and translated by Uilleam Blacker. I did read this, so we're starting off with a success, which is good because there won't be a whole lot of other success in my May book haul. But I found that when you go further back, usually there's a bit more success. Those newer ones, there's been less time. The urgency behind this one was, of course, that Oleg Sentsov is a Ukrainian author, and with everything going on in the world, and particularly in Ukraine, Good Neighbor Bookstore was trying to get out more stories about Ukraine and from Ukrainian voices, and this was part of that. It's a very tiny book. I did read it. I did enjoy it, and it did everything that they had kind of promised it would do. So we started off with a success story, Life Went On Anyway, Stories by Oleg Sentsov, and translated by Uilleam Blacker. Then we get to The Bear by Andrew Krivak. This was something that the owner of Good Neighbor Bookstore has read and loved, and I think he kind of thought it spoke to the mission of the store. I have not gotten around to reading it, but it does sound really fascinating, and I'm looking forward to it. This is a book that I probably would not have picked out on my own, and that was kind of the purpose of doing the curated book box, because I probably never would have found the Oleg Sentsov. I probably never would have found this one, and I probably never would have found the next one either. So I haven't read it, but I have noticed it on my shelf several times recently and thought I really need to get around to reading that. And I've actually been thinking about using it for a prompt on this year's reading challenge from the Montana Book Company. So I may be getting to it this year. But even if I don't, I'm fine having it on the shelf because it does sound like a really interesting book, and I'm glad that Good Neighbor managed to bring it to my attention. The final book from the curated book box was Tiny Americans, a novel by Devin Murphy. And again, this is something that I probably never would have discovered or even heard about at all if not for the curated book box. I believe Bob, the owner of the store, had said that this is one of his favorite books, and this was the one he selected for a book that he wished more people knew about. I think The Bear was one that he selected based on the mission of the store, and Oleg Sentsov was just because he had decided he wanted to help get Ukrainian voices out there. So I haven't read this yet, but it still sounds really interesting. This is another one that I have noticed on my shelf several times and thought I really want to read that. So I am hoping that I will get to it at some point soon. I just haven't managed to do it yet. Now we get into the book haul proper, away from the curated book box from Good Neighbor Bookstore. I think they did a great job. I did another curated book box later last year, and I've been thinking about doing another one this year, but we'll see how that goes. So the first book in the traditional book haul for May of 2022 was Elena Knows by Claudia Piñeiro, translated by Francis Riddle. This had been on my radar because of the International Booker Prize, and I had decided to order a copy from Montana Book Company, and here it is. I did read this book, and I loved it. It's a very difficult book, very triggering, not a happy book at all by any stretch of the imagination, but I'm really glad that I got it. I'm really glad that I read it, and it was, I can't remember if it was on the cusp, like on the lower end of my favorite reads of the year, or if it was in my almost best books of the year, but it was among my favorite reads of 2022, and won't be for everyone because again, it's dark, but I really appreciated it, and the journey that it took me on. So I'm glad that I got it, and I'm glad that I managed to read it last year. Then we have The Trees by Percival Everett. I got this for obvious reasons. It feels like this is a book that a lot of people have already read and talked about and loved, and I really would like to get to it. So I still haven't, but I'm really looking forward to finally getting it to it. I haven't read a Percival Everett book yet, but I do admire him from everything I've heard about him and from things I've heard about him in interviews. The Trees so far seems to be his biggest work, the one that most people have read, the one that most people point to. It felt like a shoo-in for the Pulitzer last year, but it didn't win, and that's a whole thing. But I would still really like to read this book, so it is not going anywhere in the meantime. Then we have The Promise by Damon Galgut. So this one was actually given to me on Independent Bookstore Day. Somebody realized that they had an advanced reader's copy, which is why it looks like this, and they hadn't read it and probably weren't going to get around to reading it, and they knew that I was interested in it because it had won the Booker Prize, so they gave it to me. And I took out things that were like freebies for Independent Bookstore Day, but I decided to leave The Promise because I do want to hold myself accountable to reading this one, even though I didn't purchase it, even though it was a gift. Therefore, it's not quite in the same league as books that I purchased for myself or, spent money on to have other people pick for me. I do want to hold myself accountable to reading this. I want to read it. I have not gotten around to it yet, but I would still very much like to. I've heard some mixed things about it, but I'm still interested in it. So hopefully I will be getting around to it at some point. The final book in my May 2022 book haul is Yerba Buena by Nina Lacour. I canceled my Book of the Month membership eventually because I realized that most of the books that I had gotten in my library and wasn't getting around to and was not interested in reading anymore had come from Book of the Month. This is an exception to that rule. I am still really interested in this one. There is a special case behind this, though. Abby, who is an employee at Montana Book Company, is a huge fan of this book, and she has told me several times that I need to read it. So I need to read it. I need to sort of fit it into my life, and I will. I promise myself I will, but I just haven't managed to do it yet. So this is not going anywhere. I do still very much want to read it, and we'll see how that goes. So I brought 7 books into my library in May 2022 that I'm including in this book haul, and of those I have read 2, which is not great. Those 2, by the way, are the Oleg Sentsov and Elena Knows. I have not unhauled any, and I don't plan to unhaul any, so that's really good as well. These are books that I still want to read, those remaining 5, and I'm happy to keep in my library in the meantime. There's much less of a sense of urgency to unhaul books lately because we expanded my library, and you can see the results here. So I'm not in a dire situation for space like I was last year at this time, but I do still want to hold myself accountable for all of my book hauls and book purchasing, so it's important. But the 5 books I do definitely still want to read, so I did a good job curating them for myself in that regard, at least. Let's move to the 2021 book haul. The first book is The Rain Heron by Robbie Arnott. I loved this book. It was one of my favorite reads of 2021. If you have not read The Rain Heron, I would absolutely recommend it to you. Basically, on Independent Bookstore Day in 2021, Charlie, one of the owners of Montana Book Company, was walking me around and recommending books to me, and this was one of them. Now, there was a prompt on the 2021 Montana Book Company Reading Challenge to pick a book based on the cover, and the second Charlie pulled this book off the shelf, I knew it was what I was going to use for that prompt, but it sounded really interesting anyway, so that was kind of like a bonus. And I love this book. If you have not read it, I would absolutely recommend it. I am not a sci-fi fantasy person, so I think it helps that this is sort of lighter on the sci-fi and fantasy elements. It reads like, I hate using the term literary fiction, but it reads like that, but with sort of sci-fi or fantasy elements thrown in. I love it. It's a really very good book. The next one was, This Is How You Lose the Time War by Amal El-Mohtar and Max Gladstone. I did read that book. I don't have my copy of it right now, because I loaned it to my neighbors, and I believe I loaned it to my neighbors in 2021, and they still have it. So I don't know if I'm ever going to get it back. It's fine. I liked it, not enough that I am desperate to have it back on my shelf. They can hold on to it. It's fine. And eventually they'll get around to reading it. They haven't yet, because we did actually talk about it fairly recently, and they hadn't read it yet. But so it's fine. It's over at my neighbor's house. They'll read it whenever, and all is good in the world. I know that sometimes it's annoying when you loan something out and you never get it back, but in this case, it's fine. They can hold on to it as long as they would like. It's not hurting anybody. So I did read it, though. I don't know if I'm ever going to have it back in my library, but I did read it, and it's fine. That takes us to Work Like Any Other by Virginia Reeves. This was another thing that was recommended by the Montana Book Company. And I did read this that same year, and I liked it. And actually, I later purchased a graphic novel that was made from this in France, and then it translated back into English. So I have that as well. But I have not read the graphic novel adaptation. I have read the original book. This had been longlisted for the 2016 Booker Prize and did not make the shortlist, but I liked it. It was an interesting book. That takes us to Paying the Land by Joe Sacco, which I believe I read last year. And this is a nonfiction graphic history. It's a fascinating book. My one complaint about it was that it did read a little bit like a textbook, but I did enjoy it. I learned a lot from it, and I would recommend it to you as well. So it's a little big, it's a little hefty, like a textbook would be, but it's a very good book. Doing well on my May 2021, but that's about to come to a stop because the next one is The Story of the Night by Colm Tóibín. So I have been on a wild roller coaster trying to decide what my first Colm Tóibín book is going to be, and I had decided that it was going to be The Story of the Night. Since then, people have recommended Blackwater Lightship to me, and I think that is probably the one that will be first, but I think because there's so much back and forth and people tell me, no, read this one, no, read this one, I end up feeling confused, and I haven't read any of them yet. So I'm probably going to try Blackwater Lightship first, but Story of the Night is something I'm still very much looking forward to reading at some point. And if you have opinions about which of his books I should read first, just know you will confuse me, but you can leave them in the comment section down below because I would be very interested in hearing. The final book that I hauled in May of 2021 was How to Resist Amazon and Why: The Fight for Local Economies, Data Privacy, Fair Labor, Independent Bookstores, and a People-Powered Future by Danny Kane. There was actually a new edition of this book, which we have purchased and is out on the coffee table, and I forgot to grab it instead. But I did read this book. This is the one that I have read. I have actually not read the expanded edition of it. I read this for the obvious reason. I am not a fan of Amazon. I don't purchase from Amazon and anything like that. I prefer to support independent bookstores. And if you would like to know why I have made that decision, this book is a really good way of explaining that. And it's very tiny. So I'm not going to give you a big speech about it right now. I'm just going to say, if you'd like to know, this gives you all of the reasons why I feel that way. So there were 6 books that I brought into my library in May of 2021. I've read 5 of them. That's really good. And I've unhauled none. So the only one I haven't read is The Story of the Night. And again, if you have opinions about which Tóibín book I should read first, let me know down below. Eventually, I will manage to read one, and it will happen. All right, we're cruising along, actually. Now we get to May of 2020. And this is a particularly interesting book haul because there's actually only one book. And I unhauled it. So I don't actually have it here. It's The Knockout Queen by Rufi Thorpe. I think when I did last year's book haul revisit, I still had it, and I mentioned that I was thinking of getting rid of it. And a couple of people did make a case for it, and that gave it a stay of execution. But over the summer, I really ran out of space. I was desperate for space on my shelves and made a lot of really tough decisions, and The Knockout Queen was one of them, because I just really thought to myself, how likely am I to read this anytime soon? How likely am I to read this in the physical book form, or how compared to audio? And I decided, if I'm going to read this, I'm probably going to do it by audio. So that is what I decided. It is not here anymore. But I know a lot of people did like that book and thought that I might like that book. So I have it saved as an audio on one of my subscription apps somewhere, and hopefully I will get around to it somewhere. So to recap, in May of 2020, I purchased 1 book. I have read 0, and I unhauled 1 book. Probably the worst record I've had in a book haul revisit for a month. But at least it was only 1. So that's really not that bad, actually. Now we get to the one that's furthest away, and that is May of 2019. Let me pull my books over here. All right, so in 2019, I had decided that I would do my Pulitzer Prize project. If you're new here, I am trying to read every book that has won a Pulitzer Prize for fiction. Somewhere along the way, I decided that I wanted to own a copy of every book that has won a Pulitzer Prize for fiction. But in 2019, I hadn't made that decision. However, if and when I saw a book that was either part of my Pulitzer Prize project or adjacent to my Pulitzer Prize project, I would grab it and bring it into my library. And that is why we have these first 2 books, Rabbit Run and Rabbit Redux by John Updike. I don't believe either one of these are Pulitzer Prize winners. John Updike won 2 Pulitzer Prizes for fiction, but I believe he won them for Rabbit is Rich and Rabbit is at Rest, which I do have copies of. They're on my Pulitzer Prize shelf, which is over there. So these are sort of an addendum, and I'm thinking, I've promised myself that for Pulitzer Prize winning books, I'm going to try to read them in print. But if there's a book that is sort of adjacent to the prize, I will allow myself to do audio. So I'm probably going to do these by audio, but they're fine staying on my shelf until now. I'm not really excited to read a John Updike book. I'm just not. And so I'm a little irritated by the fact that I'm going to have to read 4 for my Pulitzer Prize project. But worse things have happened in the world. It'll be fine. It will be fine. So I'll probably do these on audio, and then I'll make a value judgment if I want to keep these, or if I want to get rid of them and only keep the 2 Pulitzer books that are living on that shelf over there. So the other part of my Pulitzer Prize project that makes these sort of essential is that in cases where a book that won a Pulitzer Prize for fiction is a sequel, I want to at least try to read the book that came before it. People frequently bring up Lonesome Dove because I read Lonesome Dove, but I have not read the other books in that series. However, at the time Lonesome Dove won the Pulitzer Prize for fiction, it was the only book in that series. A prequel was written later, and then I believe 2 sequels were written. So I feel no obligation to read those because I read the one that had been published at the time. The thing with the Rabbit series is the second book in the series won a Pulitzer, and the 4th book in the series won a Pulitzer. So if I'm going to abide by my rules, I have to read all 4, and I have to at least try. So we'll see how that goes. I'll probably do those on audio, though. But in the meantime, they're fine hanging out on my shelf. Which takes us to The House of the Spirits by Isabel Allende. In 2019, I had set a reading goal for myself that was very large, multi-pronged and ultimately failed, and I should have known at the time that because I made it so complicated, I probably wasn't going to finish it. I didn't realize that until November, I think I realized I was in trouble, and by December, I decided to just abandon whatever I had left. This was actually going to be part of that project, and I didn't get around to it. However, I still really want to read an Isabel Allende book, and I feel like this is the sort of natural one to choose for that. It's a big book, but I am looking forward to reading it at some point. So the reason it's in my library ultimately turned out to be a failure. However, I still want to read The House of the Spirits at some point. I don't have any urgency to get to it. This is more of a library builder, a book that I'm happy to have on my shelf so that when I'm in the mood for it, it's kind of here and ready to go. So it'll be great for that. That is The House of the Spirits. Then we get to The Women of Brewster Place by Gloria Naylor. I used to have a copy of this book, and somewhere along the way, I moved a bunch of times and lost it. So I had done a book tag in 2019 called the Choose the Year book tag, and I chose the year I was born. And that included a conversation about The Women of Brewster Place. So I had my interest in reading it sparked again, and I got myself a copy of the book that I could bring home, and I finally read it last year. And I'm really glad I did. I enjoyed this book a great deal. There is a TV movie adaptation. I think it might be in 2 parts that I would like to watch at some point. I haven't yet. And now at this point, it's been a couple of months. But I think it'll be fine. And I did like this book a lot. I'm glad I finally read it and managed to fit it in. So that was a success story. And the final book in all of these book hauls is Amateur, A Reckoning with Gender, Identity, and Masculinity by Thomas Page McBee. I did read this book last year in June. It was part of my Pride Month reading. I actually listened to it on audio, and I believe Thomas Page McBee did narrate it, and it's a very good, very interesting book. I'm very glad that I got around to reading it because it really reckons with the notion of masculinity and ways in which you, even if you are someone who sort of crosses gender lines, how you are forced to conform to people's ideas of masculinity and how that idea is so pervasive that you can end up going along with it even if you don't realize it. So even if you would like to prefer to, I think that you might be above such a thing. It's a really interesting book. I identified with it in a lot of ways because although I am not transgender, I have sort of struggled with identifying with what, this sort of masculine ideal. So I could relate to this book a lot, and I would encourage other people who might feel similarly to try it as well. It was great on audio, but I have a copy of the book as well, and because I liked it so much, I'm happy keeping it. So in May of 2019, I brought 5 books into my library. I've read 3 of them, so it's not a bad track record. I've unhauled 0, and honestly, none of them are on the cusp of an unhaul. The only ones I haven't read are the Rabbit books by John Updike. And I can see a future where I might get rid of them, but in that future, I will have read them and decided that I didn't like them. And I'm trying to maintain an open mind about John Updike until I give him a try. I am not thinking I'm going to like him, but maybe I will. Maybe I'll be surprised. If I read them and I am surprised, they'll stay. If I read them and I don't like them, those 2 will go. I'll keep the 2 Pulitzer winners, but those would go. But that's the only scenario in which they would be gone. So overall, I brought 19 books into my library over the past 4 Mays. I've read 10, which is not bad. That's 50% more. I don't know how to do math, so I'm just going to stick with 50%, even though I know it's a little more. That's a good track record. I've only unhauled 1. I don't know if one of them is ever going to come back to me. And there are maybe some that I would think about unhauling in the future, but this is a good, solid bunch of books. By and large, I don't feel any urgency to get rid of any of them. I don't feel like any are on the cusp of being eliminated from my library or anything like that. So if you have thoughts about any of these books or anything I've said in this video, let me know in the comment section down below. If you have recommendations based on my interest in any of these books, I'd love to hear that as well. Please let me know in the comments. As always, I really appreciate your time, and I will be back. Until next time, happy reading.